You think space is just distance, a gap, a backdrop, a cold emptiness stretching between real things. You imagine stars, planets, galaxies, and between them, almost nothing. That is the picture in your head, and it is wrong. Not slightly wrong, structurally wrong, because you still think space is passive. You still think it just sits there and allows the universe to happen. It does not. The deeper physics looked, the less space behaved like absence, the less it behaved like a container, the less it behaved like nothing at all. And Feynman understood how dangerous that is, because once you stop treating space like emptiness, other things begin to fail with it. Distance starts to feel less solid. Location starts to feel less obvious. Even the idea that reality unfolds on a stable stage starts to come apart. You want space to be simple because your mind needs a place to put things. A star goes there. A planet goes here. Light travels through the middle. Clean, quiet, reasonable. But if the stage itself is active, if the vacuum is not empty, if nothing is already doing something, then you are not looking at a universe built inside space. You may be looking at a universe where space was never what you thought it was, and that is the disturbing part. Not that Feynman found something hidden out in the cosmos, but that the deeper he looked, the more the emptiness itself stopped making sense. The picture. You trust a picture you've never questioned. Space is empty, things exist inside it, and everything happens in between. It feels obvious. You look at the night sky and you see separation, stars scattered across darkness, vast gaps between objects, silence stretched over distance. So your mind builds a rule. Space is nothing, and nothing does nothing. It just sits there. You don't think about it. You don't need to. The idea is clean, stable, useful, but it comes from the wrong place. It comes from scale. At your level, human level, space behaves predictably. You walk across a room, you throw an object, you watch it move through air. Everything appears to happen inside a quiet background that does not interfere. So you generalize. You assume that if you remove everything, air, light, matter, you are left with a pure version of that same background, an empty stage. But that assumption was never tested where physics actually operates, because you've never experienced true emptiness. Even your imagination fails here. Try it. Remove everything in your mind. No stars, no light, no objects. What do you see? Darkness. But darkness is still something. It has depth. It has extension. It has a sense of space. You haven't removed the stage. You've only turned off the lights. And that's the problem, because physics does not allow you to assume the stage exists in the first place. It asks a different question, not what is inside space, but what justifies the idea of space at all. That question feels unnecessary at first, almost philosophical, but it becomes unavoidable the moment you try to describe reality at its most basic level, because the deeper you go, the less space behaves like something that can simply be assumed. It stops acting like a passive container. It starts behaving like part of the system. And once that happens, your original picture begins to crack. Because if space is not just sitting there, if it is not neutral, if it is not truly empty, then the foundation you built everything on is not stable. It only felt stable because you never pushed it far enough. Feynman did. And what he found was not a more detailed version of your picture. It was the beginning of its collapse. When nothing refuses to stay still, you expect emptiness to be quiet, not just visually quiet, physically quiet. If there is nothing there, then nothing should happen. No motion, no energy, no change. That is the definition you are holding on to. And it feels unavoidable, because if nothing can still do something, then the word itself loses meaning. So let's take your definition seriously. Imagine removing everything. No particles, no radiation, no heat, no motion, a perfect vacuum. According to your intuition, this should be the most uneventful state possible, a complete stillness. But this is exactly where physics begins to disagree with you, because when you try to describe this perfect emptiness using the rules that actually govern reality, something unexpected appears. It does not settle, it does not become silent, it fluctuates, not dramatically, not visibly, but fundamentally. There is a kind of unavoidable restlessness built into what you thought should be perfectly still. And this is not a technical flaw, it is not a limitation of measurement, It is a requirement of the system. Even in the absence of everything you can remove, there remains a minimum level of activity that cannot be eliminated, a baseline, and that baseline behaves like energy, which creates a contradiction because you believe that if there is no energy, nothing can happen. But now you are faced with a situation where nothing still carries energy, not added from outside, not temporarily introduced. It is simply there as part of what the vacuum is. Now your mind tries to repair this. You might say, fine, maybe it's not perfectly empty, but it's still close enough. But that adjustment misses the point entirely because this activity is not happening inside space. It is what space is doing. The vacuum is not a passive absence waiting for something to occur. It is already behaving, already shifting, already refusing to remain completely still. At scales too small for direct experience, this empty space is constantly changing. Tiny disturbances appear and disappear,
are not because something is being created in the usual sense, but because the system cannot remain perfectly inactive. It is unstable in a very precise way, and that forces you into a difficult position, because your definition of nothing depended on stillness. Nothing should not change. Nothing should not produce effects. Nothing should not contain energy. But now you have a version of nothing that violates all of those expectations. Quietly, consistently, inevitably. So you are left with a choice. Either you keep your definition and reject what physics is telling you, or you accept the behavior and admit that what you called nothing was never truly nothing. Feynman did not hesitate here. He did not try to protect the intuition. He removed it, because once you accept that even emptiness cannot stay still,
and the question shifts. It is no longer what exists inside space. It becomes what kind of thing is space if it behaves like this? And that question does not lead to clarity. It leads to something far less comfortable. The collapse of the stage. You are still holding on to one idea, even after all this. You're willing to accept that empty space isn't perfectly empty. You're willing to accept that something is happening there. But you still believe space is just the place where it happens. A background, a stage, something separate from the events themselves. That belief feels safe. It keeps everything organized. Objects do things. Space holds them. Simple. But this is where the separation begins to fail, because the deeper physics looks, the harder it becomes to draw a line between what is happening and where it is happening. Take a particle again, not your simplified version, the real one. You imagine it as a tiny object moving through space, a point traveling along a path. But that picture does not survive, because what you call a particle is not a self-contained object. It is a disturbance, a localized pattern in something that already exists everywhere, a field. And that field is not placed inside space like an object in a box. It is spread across it, continuous, connected, everywhere at once. So now the particle is no longer separate from the background. It is a feature of the background, a ripple in it, and that changes everything, because you can no longer say, this is the object, and that is the space around it. The distinction dissolves. The object is a behavior of the space. Now push that further. If particles are just patterns in fields, and fields are not separate from space, then space is not just holding things, it is participating in what they are, actively. Its structure determines how those patterns behave. Its properties define what is possible. Change the structure of space, and you change the behavior of everything within it. Not occasionally, always. Which means space is not neutral. A true background would not influence outcomes. It would not impose rules. It would not shape behavior. But space does all of those things. It carries constraints. It enforces consistency. It allows some interactions and forbids others. So ask yourself, if something defines the rules of a system, if it shapes every outcome within it, if nothing inside it can escape its influence, is it still just a stage, or is it part of the system itself? Feynman did not treat space as a passive container. He treated it as something inseparable from the behavior of reality, because once you see particles as patterns, once you see fields as continuous, once you see interactions as fundamental, there is no clean boundary left, no clear separation between what happens and where it happens. And when that boundary disappears, something subtle breaks, because the idea of where begins to lose meaning, not completely, but fundamentally. And that is where the discomfort deepens, because you are no longer questioning details. You are questioning the framework you use to place anything anywhere at all. Looking changes what exists. You still believe you can step outside it, that you can observe without interfering, that you can look at reality and simply uncover what is already there. It feels reasonable. You don't change the sky by looking at it. You don't disturb a distant star by observing its light. So you assume the same must be true at every level. That observation reveals it does not. Because at the level where Feynman was working, observation is not passive. It is an interaction. An interaction means influence. To observe anything, you must exchange something with it. Light, energy, momentum. You cannot see without touching, and that touch is not optional. Now your intuition tries to escape this. You imagine using a softer method. A gentler probe, something that reveals without disturbing, but physics removes that option. There is a limit. If you reduce the disturbance, you reduce what you can know. If you increase precision, you increase interference. You cannot have both. So the idea of just looking begins to collapse, because there is no such thing. Every measurement changes the system, not slightly, necessarily. And the deeper you go, the more unavoidable that change becomes. When physicists examine what you call empty space, they are not uncovering a fixed structure waiting to be revealed. They are forcing the system to respond. They are creating conditions under which space behaves in a certain way, and that behavior cannot be separated from the act of observation itself. This is where your picture fails again. You want reality to have a definite state, something that exists independently of how you look at it, but the deeper rules do not guarantee that. What you observe depends on how you observe, not loosely, precisely. Change the way you measure, and you change what can be said to exist. So now space is not just active. It is not just participating. It is also resisting definition, because every attempt to pin it down alters the very thing you are trying to describe. And that creates a deeper instability, because if observation is part of the system, if you cannot stand outside it, if every answer depends on the question you ask, then what does it mean to say what space really is? Feynman did not try to force a stable answer out of this. He accepted the instability. Because once you understand that observation is not separate from reality, you lose the idea of a fixed description waiting to be discovered. You are no longer uncovering a hidden truth. You are participating in the process that defines it. And that means the deeper you look, the less you can separate what exists from how you are looking at it. The end of solid things, you are still expecting a final layer, something firm, something that does not dissolve. Even after giving up empty space, even after losing a passive background, even after accepting that observation interferes, you still believe that at the deepest level, reality must become clear, defined, solid, a particle perhaps, a smallest unit, something that simply is. But that expectation does not survive, because the deeper physics looks, the less reality behaves like something you can point to. Take a particle again, not the simplified version, the real one. You try to assign it a position, a specific place, but the moment you do that precisely, something else slips away. Its motion becomes uncertain. You try to fix its motion instead, then its position spreads out, not because your tools are weak, because reality itself does not allow both to exist sharply at the same time. So the particle begins to lose its identity as a point. It becomes a spread, a range, a distribution of possibilities. Now your instinct is to resist this. You think maybe it still has a definite position. We just don't know it yet. But that interpretation does not hold, because the mathematics does not describe hidden certainty. It describes something more uncomfortable, that there is no exact value to uncover, only probabilities, only potential outcomes. So the particle is no longer an object. It becomes a description of what could happen when you interact with it. A cloud of possibilities, not a thing sitting somewhere. Now push that further. If particles are not solid, if their properties are not fixed, if their existence is tied to interaction, then the idea of solid reality begins to disappear. You no longer have tiny objects moving through space. You have patterns of probability interacting with other patterns. Nothing sharply defined until something forces a result, and even that result is temporary, context dependent. So your last anchor begins to dissolve. No fixed particles, no definite positions, no clean paths.
Feynman described this in a way that makes the discomfort unavoidable. He did not say a particle takes one path from one point to another. He described it as exploring all possible paths, every route, every variation, every alternative. And what you observe is the result of all those possibilities interfering with each other, not because reality is confused, but because your expectation of a single, clean trajectory was never valid. So now you are left without solidity, without sharpness, without objects that simply exist in the way you imagined, only relationships, only probabilities, only outcomes that depend on interaction. And at this point, something deeper begins to shift.
Because if nothing is truly solid, if nothing has a fixed identity, if everything depends on context, then the idea of things existing in space starts to lose its meaning entirely. Space was never the beginning. You have been assuming a starting point. Space exists first, then everything else happens inside it. That idea has been quietly supporting everything you believe so far. Even after losing solid particles, even after accepting instability, you still imagine that somewhere underneath all of this, space itself remains a foundation, something that does not need to be explained, but nothing you've seen actually requires that to be true. In fact, everything you've seen begins to suggest the opposite, because if particles are not objects, if their behavior depends on interaction, if nothing exists independently, then what exactly is space? You've been treating it like a container, but containers are separate from what they contain, and that separation no longer holds. So the role of space begins to change, not something that exists first, something that appears later, an outcome, a result of deeper relationships. This is where the idea becomes difficult, because it removes the last familiar structure. You are used to thinking in terms of position, where something is, how far apart things are, what direction they move. All of that depends on space being real in a fundamental way. But if space is emergent, then those ideas are not basic. They are constructed.
They arise when something deeper organizes itself in a certain way. Think of it like this. Instead of starting with points in space, imagine starting with connections, relationships, rules that determine how one part of the system influences another. No coordinates, no distances, just interactions. And from those interactions, something that looks like space begins to form. Structure appears. Patterns stabilize. Distances become meaningful, but they were not there at the beginning. They emerged, which means space is not the foundation of reality. It is a consequence of it. And that changes the question again, because now you cannot ask what exists inside space. You have to ask what produces the appearance of space in the first place. And that question does not have a clean answer. Even now,
Even at the front edge of physics, there are theories, many of them, that try to describe how space might emerge from something more fundamental: information, quantum relationships, abstract structures that do not resemble space at all, but none of them restore your original intuition. None of them bring back a simple stage where everything neatly unfolds. Feynman didn't claim to solve this completely, but his way of thinking pointed directly toward it, because once you describe reality in terms of all possible paths, once you focus on interactions rather than objects, once you abandon fixed trajectories, space stops being necessary as a starting point. It becomes a useful description, a large-scale pattern, something that appears stable only because you are not looking closely enough. So now the ground beneath you shifts again. You are no longer standing inside space. You are inside a system that produces the illusion of space. And that illusion is convincing until you start asking where it comes from. Nothing to stand on. Now, stop. Look at what remains. You began with something stable, a quiet emptiness, a clear stage, solid objects moving through it, and one by one, those pieces disappeared. Empty space wasn't empty. The background wasn't passive. Observation wasn't neutral. Particles weren't solid. And now space itself may not even be fundamental. At each step, You adjusted. You let go of one assumption, then another, but something deeper has been happening underneath all of that. You have been losing the idea that reality has a foundation, not replacing it, losing it. Because every time you try to point to something that simply exists on its own, physics removes that independence. Particles depend on interaction. Properties depend on measurement. Space depends on deeper structure. Nothing stands alone. Everything is defined through something else, so the idea of isolated existence begins to collapse. No object exists by itself. No space exists independently. No observer stands outside the system. Only relationships remain, only connections, only a network where every part depends on every other part. And this is where the discomfort becomes unavoidable, because your intuition depends on separation. You think in terms of things, this object, that location, this event happening there, but those distinctions are no longer fundamental. They are approximations, useful at large scales, but not real in the way you thought. So now ask yourself something simple. If nothing exists independently, if everything is defined through interaction, if there is no fixed background, no solid objects, no external observer, then what is reality made of? Not things, not space, not even events in the usual sense. It becomes something harder to picture, a system without a center, a structure without a base layer, a network where the idea of a starting point does not apply. And your mind resists this. It wants a bottom level, a final answer, something that does not depend on anything else. But the deeper you go, the less that idea survives. Feynman didn't offer you a replacement for that comfort. He showed you how to think without it, to accept that reality may not be built on a clean, stable foundation. Only deeper descriptions, more precise rules, better approximations, but no final ground, and that leaves you somewhere unfamiliar, not confused, not ignorant, but without anything left to stand on. What Feynman really saw you, expected an answer, something hidden, something waiting to be discovered, a deeper layer that would finally make everything make sense. That is how you think progress works. You look deeper, you remove uncertainty, you arrive at something more real, but that is not what happened here. The deeper you looked, the less stable everything became, not because reality is chaotic, but because your expectations were. You expected emptiness and found activity. You expected a stage and found participation. You expected solid things and found probabilities. You expected a foundation and found none.
And now you are left with something that does not resolve into a clean picture, only a shift. Because what Feynman really saw was not a hidden structure behind space. It was the failure of the idea that space is something simple at all. Not a container, not a background, not even something that necessarily exists in the way you imagine. Just a pattern that appears when deeper rules interact. A description that works until you push it too far. And when you do, it dissolves. Quietly, without drama, without a clear replacement. So now you are left with a question that does not have a comfortable answer. Not what is in space, not even what is space, but why did you need space to be simple in the first place? Because your mind requires stability. It builds models that feel solid.
It separates things so they can be understood. But reality does not owe you that structure. It does not simplify itself to match your intuition. And the deeper you look, the less it tries. So the disturbing part is not that space is full of hidden activity. It is not that the vacuum fluctuates. It is not even that nothing behaves like something. The disturbing part is that the closer you get to the foundation, the less it looks like a foundation at all. Only relationships, only interactions, only a system that does not reduce to something simpler. And that means the idea of nothing, the quiet emptiness you started with, was never a real possibility, just a story your mind told itself, a way to make the universe feel structured, predictable, contained. But once you look too deeply, once you follow the logic all the way down, that story stops working and it does not get replaced. It just ends, leaving you with something quieter than an answer, a realization that what you thought was the simplest part of reality was the least understood.